This is Dennis Chers. I'm teaching American literature at Seton Hill University. This podcast attempts to situate us in history as we understand a little bit about America so that we'll be ready to explore the American values that we'll find in our literary texts. Now, from the limited perspective of literature, before 1800, there really isn't a whole lot to look at in terms of American literature. Now, the most educated Americans were educated in Europe, and what they wrote, their songs, their poetry, what they read, all their art, it really echoed what Europe was interested in. So from our perspective as students of American literature, understanding the history of America helps us understand what got American literature started. The greatest minds in America in colonial times were really busy with nonfiction. You had, you may have heard of the Declaration of Independence, Constitution of the United States, these sorts of things. So the American period before 1800 is usually covered by historians rather than literary scholars. But in order to understand and recognize the important themes in American literature, we do need to understand how those historical forces set up tensions that we see American authors trying to work out really up to this day. And those tensions include the relationships between the indigenous peoples and the European newcomers. It deals with the relationship between the settlers and the forces of nature. Here we have an iconic representation of the first Thanksgiving and a reminder that the Pilgrims had armed themselves against an environment that seemed very hostile to their understanding. We also see in American literature a tension between two different kinds of American dreams. You've got the lone nomad whose ideal is being true to himself and nothing else, and you also have the white picket fence in suburbia and being a good, productive member of society that shapes you. And that's a tension that we often see in American literature. We also see a tension between Southern agrarian culture and Northern industrialism, and all that good stuff about race, class, and gender, and how who we are and what our experiences are define us and are interpreted by the people around us. So a few key historical points. Christopher Columbus, of course, 1492. Not realizing there's a whole continent in his way, Columbus searches for a way to sail west from Europe around the world of India, and he bumps into this land where he sees people that he calls Indians because he thinks he's found India. Well, he hasn't, of course, but he didn't know that. In the 1500s, you actually see a very strong Spanish presence from Central America right up through the Mississippi. In 1607, you see the first successful English settlement at Jamestown, Virginia. This is the first successful English colony. About 13 years later, 1620, here we have a representation of the Pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts Bay. The Pilgrims were Protestant Christians who were rather unwelcome in Europe. They were kind of troublemakers because they didn't fit the mold. They landed here in Plymouth Rock. Now, in the 1600s, a significant proportion of colonists arrived as indentured servants. Now, most of those were white. They were people who pledged to serve a master for a period of time in return for housing and vocational training, transportation to America, etc. Court records do show that a free black man named Anthony Johnson won a court ruling that found another black man named John Casor, C-A-S-O-R. The court ruling found that this other man was Johnson's servant for life, and this is apparently the first record in the Commonwealth of Virginia of what we would call slavery. And ironically, the owner was a black man who owned another black man. So race and the legacy of slavery pervades American culture. In 1692, we have the Salem witch trials. There was a panic in several New England towns near Salem, Massachusetts, and it leads to people being tried, accused, tried, and in many cases executed for witchcraft. Now, just about 60 years later, Benjamin Franklin does his famous kite experiment. This is 1752. His discoveries and inventions include the lightning rod and the Franklin stove and bifocals. He invented an odometer for a wagon, a cartwheel. He invented the concept of fire insurance and fire brigades. So just 60 years after this very destructive superstition of the witch trials, you have Franklin showing us a little bit of the American ingenuity and industry that's emerging through Franklin, and we'll see it pervade through fiction and other literary works as well. Franklin himself wrote witty little satirical essays. He wrote a lot of catchphrases. A penny saved is a penny earned, and honesty is the best policy. Franklin didn't write full-length novels or treatises. He'd been very popular on Twitter, but he didn't produce the kind of fictional works that we'll be studying in our class. Now, 1754, we have the French and Indian War. It's a confusing name because it was the French and the Indians were ganged up on one side against the American colonists and their British protectors. So the war actually starts with the French Empire and the English Empire struggling for territory, and they were actually struggling for territory right around Pittsburgh. And that squabble set some sparks that ended up spreading into Europe and really around the world long after it settled down in America. So during the French and Indian War, we have a young George Washington fighting on the same side as the British Redcoats against the French. Now, 1773, here a little bit of the French and Indian War. In 1773, we have the economically crushed by heavy taxes that England has levied in order to finance its ongoing wars. The American colonies rise up against the taxes, and this is a lithograph representing the Boston Tea Party. In 1776, the Second Continental Congress ratifies the Declaration of Independence, and this is the first time that history tells us any colony has declared its moral and legal independence from its parent country. And the grounds given for this are that God has granted the right to govern not to the king, not to the pharaoh, not to the aristocracy, but to the people. And the people have this right that no unjust government action can take away from them. It's a huge philosophical and political set of implications for our country and also the world at large. 1789, the Constitution is in place. We have our first presidential elections, and General Washington is elected as president. He's re-elected in 1792. In 1793, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, which makes cotton farming a very productive, lucrative industry, provided you have cheap laborers. And the same year, and I'm sure it's no coincidence, the Fugitive Slave Law is enacted, which argued that if you were a slave that escaped a state that had slavery, and you escaped to a state that was free, the federal powers enabled the local authorities to grab you and take you back to the slave state, even though you had made your way to a free state. So this is sets up tensions that really lead up to the Civil War. Okay, Washington, who is still popular in 1796, steps down instead of taking his a third term. And the guy on the left here is John Adams, who's elected. He does not get elected for a second term of president, and on the right here we have Thomas Jefferson is elected as a third president. And that really starts a period of great expansion in America. In 1803, we have the Louisiana Purchase, in which Thomas Jefferson, on behalf of the new nation, the United States, buys this center green chunk of territory from France. Napoleon needed the cash to fund his ongoing wars. And we have Meriwether Lewis in 1803, arriving in Pittsburgh to start the Lewis and Clark expedition on orders of Thomas Jefferson in order to establish an American presence up in the Pacific Northwest. And so Lewis and Clark go ahead and do this with the native guide Sacagawea. And the center of the nation's population is steadily moving west. We have here a representation of manifest destiny, this goddess-like character kind of floating, hovering westward, bringing, we see that she's stringing telegraph wires. The train is following in her wake. And you see the natives are running away, cowering from her. And we see the darkness off in the west is being, enveloped by this glowing, rosy light to the east. So this painting is a depiction of how America thought of itself. They thought that God gave us this land for the purpose of, enlightening and educating and chasing away the natives and their pagan way of life and replacing it with modern ways of life. So American literature is deeply invested in this concept of expansion, conquering the wilderness, and taking these natural resources and putting them to productive use rather than just wasting them lying around on the ground. That's part of American industry mindset. Okay, so among the issues that we have, you have a large number of Catholic immigrants coming from nations like Ireland and Poland and Italy. And there was a lot of pushback from Protestant America. Here we have the Promised Land as seen from the dome of St. Peter's, Rome. And here the Pope is pointing westward, and the monks are staring off to the west, and they're snickering, plotting a takeover of America. So as mainstream Protestant America was expanding westward, they also feared losing this land to the new crop of immigrants. In 1810, we had 17 states and a population of 7 million. By 1861, 34 states, a population of 31 million. Commerce was increasing, interstate travel. Thomas Jefferson loved technology, but it was the ingenuity of the watchmaker and the skill of the artisan that Jefferson admired. Jefferson loved technology and industry, but he did not really have a lot of interest in mass production. He didn't really like workers. He was an aristocrat. He was nervous by the changes that he saw. He and other founding figures in American history. With the rise of the middle class, here we have a typical 19th century middle class family, we see an increasing stratification of society. The rich getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. In earlier couple generations in America, a middle class family might have one or two servants. I don't mean slaves, but people who were uneducated, recent immigrants who would take care of the family and do a lot of the rote mechanical chores that, we in our modern lives have dishwashers and we have, lawnmowers and things like that. In a previous century, a middle-class American family might have had one or two servants to do those sorts of things. And then those undereducated workers who worked as domestic servants, wouldn't be on the streets. They would get a fair meal, and maybe their children would be raised in the household and educated along with the children of the masters, and it would be a way to raise yourself up socially. Now that America is putting all its effort into, middle-class families putting a lot of its money into technology as opposed to putting it into the salaries for, cheap labor. Society is stratifying quite a lot. The owners of those machines are getting money that would have gone to help raise the lowest class people up to a level of respectability. So here we see representation, iconic representation of the American family unit, and this is something that we see throughout American literature. Now, American freedom of press helped create an environment in which controversial and dangerous and minority voices could be heard. This was different from Europe, where the literary figures were mostly educated at the top universities and often wrote about things that upper-class people cared about. In America, for all our flaws, for all our social stratification, for all the horrible legacy of slavery, and when we look back historically, the oppression of women, for all that, Americans were pretty darn multicultural in that alternative voices found their way into the free press, alternative ways of belief found their way into churches and synagogues and on the streets, and these voices combined in a way that it was really unique and helped create an American identity. Among those striking voices that we'll take a look at in a next podcast on close reading, we'll take a look at a poem written by Phyllis Wheatley. She was actually writing in the time period just before our 1800s starts. She was writing just before the Revolutionary War, but we'll take a look at one of her poems that combines race and religion and gender in a typically American mix of possibility and tension and contradiction that I think you might find insightful. Another story that we'll take a look at, you might recognize this image. Old guy lying in the woods carrying a rifle after having fallen asleep for 20 years. This is a painting of Rip Van Winkle. It's actually in the Westmoreland Gallery of Westmoreland Museum of American Art just downtown in Greensburg. And this story of Rip Van Winkle is an early, really unique American story that combined the American interest in politics and family and some traditional references to gender politics that I think will also be interesting to take a look at. But that's one of our early readings that we'll take a look at soon. Washington Irving was an early person trying to make a living as a professional writer, and however he needed to go to Europe to do that. Anyway, we'll learn more about them a little bit later in separate podcasts. So what we've done is we've just taken a brief overview in some of the key forces that that American literature and American culture are sort of combining. The people reading literature around the early period 1800s of our course, they would be very aware of all the forces and historical events that I just sort of briefly ran through for you. So keep those in mind. Happy reading, and I'll see you online as we continue this American Lit class.